Now, a little bit about the track before we get into it. This track Low is what was again meant to be my debut single, and I wanted it to be a minimalistic track. I was going from a tech house track to another track. I wanted it also to be house, so this track was crafted intentionally to be my debut single. This is the only track where I sat down. I realized I had a bunch of melodic tracks already written and kind of produced, but I didn't want it to be my debut single. I wanted something a little bit more listenable, if that's a word, to be my debut single. So I sat down, I thought, you know what, I need to make a track. I'm sitting down, I'm going to make a track right now, and this is the only time it worked, and it's representative, and I mean, it will be clear in a second because it's a very minimalistic track. So again, this was crafted to be my debut single, to be, listenable, and just to have a little bit of fun. I know I said this 3 times. This is gonna be my 3rd time saying this already because I mentioned it was kind of in my debut track in a way. So let's talk about what I mean by that. Now, as I mentioned a few seconds ago, Low and the Fake ID Tech House remix were my house tracks, but I always knew that wasn't the style that I wanted to stick to. I like house. I have fun with house music. But when it comes to the artists that inspired me, it wasn't house artists, and that wasn't actually the music that got me into electronic music in the first place. So all that means is that when I was making those house tracks, I always knew they weren't going to be kind of my style, and that something like this would be. So about Exposition, I wanted it to represent the sounds that I like in many ways, which is why it's 150 BPM, kind of aiming for a melodic dubstep style. It has, some synth build-up, some heavy basses, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of emotion, a little bit of glitches, a lot of atmospheres. So I really wanted to capture the essence of literally as an exposition of my sound. And that's why this track was made. So long story short, this was also my debut track in a way. But this was me just kind of showing the world what I am, who I can do, and how I want to do it. Which is why, after some brainstorming and after some kind of little bit of just research on synonyms of words, I ended with Exposition, and I think it's the perfect name for the track. It really just captures exactly what I want it to be, which is kind of an introduction to me and to my style and to my sound. So before we get into this track, naturally, I'm going to talk about why I made this track and why I named it Express, actually, because music with intention, right? So why did I make this track? 2 reasons. Number 1, I like drum and bass tracks. I like drum and bass, so I wanted to make a drum and bass track. And furthermore, I didn't just want to make a drum and bass track, but I really like kind of these melodic and big synth heavy drum and bass tracks that there aren't really a lot out there. And don't get me wrong, I love aggressive drum and bass. I listen to a little bit of Liquid. I really like dance floor drum and bass, and I love those tracks. I love that genre. But I also really like melodic drum and bass, which I feel is a little bit less represented, which is why I wanted to make this, right? I wanted to take my sound, me as a producer, and make a melodic, emotional drum and bass track. It's not so melodic. It's not so emotional. At the end of the day, it's a drum and bass track with, a lot of energy. It's 174 BPM, as you can see. But I wanted to put my own spin to it. I wanted to make it mine, right? I wanted to make a track that was representative of my sound in the form of drum and bass, I guess you can say. And Express is kind of different because it's a drum and bass track, but I really just wanted to take it as something more than that. As I've talked about music as a form of art, and that's really what I was trying to do here, because not a lot of artists are making kind of this type of melodic drum and bass, and it was really my goal to kind of just express that you can make music in any way you want, not especially, but including something like this, where you have a drum and bass track, 174 BPM, but with these melodic elements, with these emotional elements to some extent, big supersaws, big leads, and all that stuff, right? So that was pretty much my intention there. My intention was just to express the sound that I like in the form of drum and bass. That was really what I was going for. So again, this track is all about expression. When I wanted to name the track, it was really hard to name. I went through a bunch of kind of words that I was messing around with, but ultimately Express really just captured what I was trying to kind of go for, because what I was trying to go for is kind of like here. It was almost like here it is, here's some, here's my sound, here's some sound, here's some music that really represents who I am, but I like drum and bass, so here it is in the form of drum and bass, right? But here's what I want to do, and here's what I can do. Here's how I express myself. So why not combine, drum and bass and emotional melodic songs? And here it is, me expressing that through this track. All right, so per usual, before we get into the breakdown, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I made this track. So why did I make this track? Because I wanted to make a progressive house track. It's actually the first track I've released at 128 BPM. I'm a big fan of 140, 90 BPM I made a drum and bass track. I think I was at 172 or 174. This was my first 128 release. Progress, I think, is the first track I made that was built off of a good foundation, good sample selection, and I was able to apply good mixing skills, not amazing mixing skills, but good mixing skills, decent mixing skills at the very least, to a good foundation and make it sound pretty good. So why did I name this track Progress? I named this track Progress for two reasons. Again, I mentioned it's kind of a two-in-one name. Progress. Number one, progressive house, progress. It's free. But number two, this track, I recognize that this track had kind of the next step in my mixing abilities, not only my mixing abilities, but to some extent my production abilities as well. So I wanted this track to represent kind of that it was a next step in something, next step in my journey, and next step in kind of this whole journey as an artist and as a producer, which is why I wanted to name the track Progress, and kind of a two-in-one Progress. Progress makes more sense, but it just kind of sounds weird if I named the track Progress. But Progress makes sense because there's two intentions for this track. Number one, the progression from in my abilities, right? The progress I've made in my abilities to mix and to get better at mixing. But number two, I named this track Progress/Progress because the genre is progressive house, and even though I'm using it kind of in the colloquial sense, progression is the main characteristic here. I've talked a lot about intention. I've talked a lot about expression. And the way I see it, I kind of see my discography as reflections of that. Exposition as my debut single really signifies intention. It's doing something intentional and kind of having a purpose behind why you do things and why you do what you do. Express signifies expression, right? It's just trying to capture a feeling and, hey, I'm making a drum and bass track, but let's make it happy. Let's make it joyful. Let's make it angelic. And let's just use sounds I like. This is how I express myself. This track is all about progression. So again, I talked about how it represents the kind of the progress I've made mixing, but it's also about progression as a whole, about how we use progression, how you can use progressions in tracks. So this does some really, at least for my style, untraditional things, but that I really like, that I think kind of set a tone and set a definition of what progression is in tracks and why I preach it as so important. I've mentioned in the past, and the last thing I'll say about this, because it's so important, I've mentioned in my other breakdown videos that progression in your tracks is so important that I think every track should have some form of progression, or if it doesn't have progression, it should be intentional that it doesn't have progression. So having a track dedicated to progression, I think, is just so important for me that I mean, the fact that I praise progression so highly, that's what this track was ultimately meant to do. It was made to A, be a progressive house track because I wanted to make a progressive house track, B, emphasize the point of progress in your tracks and progression in your tracks, and making sure things aren't stale, and not just not stale, but kind of moving towards something. And C, as I made it, I realized that it was kind of an important milestone in my mixing and artist journey because my mixing was a lot better. So that's pretty much why I made this track, the foundations of this track, and why this track is important to me. So naturally, before we break down this track, we're going to talk about why I made this track, because that's just what I do. And again, there's a lot I want to mention about that. Well, why do I like electronic music? What is so great about electronic music? How does electronic music make me feel? And after a lot of brainstorming and a lot of thinking, I ultimately ended up with the word release. And release kind of comes from two places, because not only is it just the raw feeling of release you get when listening to electronic music, where you have this buildup that builds up tension and maybe takes away elements or adds more elements to a moment of release, and that drop where you get everything right in your face and everything just kind of comes at you at once. So there's a raw feeling of release already in electronic music when it comes to that buildup and the drop. But moreover, as I was saying earlier, when it comes to those artists that inspire me, that are really emotional and melodic, release almost existed in another way, where it became this thing where you're listening to these tracks and these songs, and you're just forgetting about where you are in the moment. And as I mentioned, you're being taken somewhere else, which kind of allows you to just forget about everything and really just only listen to this track. It's almost like you're being taken to a universe or to a world where nothing else exists but this track, and you can forget about everything that's going on in the moment, anything weighing you down, anything that worries you, and you're just letting all of that go for 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes or however long the track is. But that's really the moment that you're experiencing, where you're letting everything go. So again, it's not only the raw feeling of release that you get from the build up and the drop, and where everything just kind of hits you and it feels like everything that's pent up is being let go, but it's also the feeling that you get when you're being transported somewhere else, when you're listening to these tracks and being so immersed in them that you're forgetting about everything else and you're pretty much coexisting with the music that you're listening to. So that's how I came up with the name and kind of the general, not only term, but the idea of release in electronic music. And that's something I wanted to embody, which is why I made this track, right? And I made this track pretty much with the inspiration of those artists that I mentioned, Porter Robinson and Millennium, especially this style. And my goal here was just to capture that in a track and capture my favorite sounds and favorite feelings in a track. In this case, a summer track that has these kind of heavenly, angelic, and melodic features that really take you somewhere else and transport you and have you immersed in the track. That's why this track is actually so meaningful to me, because when I started producing, my goal was always to make emotional and melodic music that would take you somewhere else, just like the music that inspired me. But that's why I like this track so much, because in my eyes, and making a track like this, then such an angelic and melodic track that really immerses you with all these big supersaws and angelic feelings, it pretty much puts me in the same realm as those artists that inspired me so much, that I'm trying to accomplish the same thing as those artists that inspired me so much by making these emotional and melodic tracks that really have you, immersed in the track and basking in the supersaws and really enjoying everything that it is, which is why I like this track so much. In my eyes, having this track now puts me on the kind of the same playing field as those artists. Now, of course, I'm nowhere as successful as those artists, at least not yet, but having this track puts me in that realm of an emotional and melodic producer that transports you somewhere and really puts a lot of effort and intention into these tracks that are just trying to invoke a feeling at the end of the day and having you experience what it means to build up that feeling and being taken somewhere else and letting everything go for, in this case, about 4 minutes. So that's why this track is so meaningful to me. So without further ado, let's talk about why I made this track. So why did I make this track? I didn't make this track for any specific intention in a way. There's intention behind it, which I'll get to. But there's no expression here, right? There's no really emotion being portrayed. I'll tell you a little bit about why I actually made the track in a second. But again, this is an interesting track because it's not interesting. So that aside, why did I make this track? I made this track for 2 reasons. Number one, I was kind of, just making tracks, getting an idea of the tracks I wanted to make. And 2 things happened. The first one is that, if you saw the last track breakdown, if you saw a release track breakdown, I mentioned that in release, I started to mess around with Splice, and I finally started to scroll through Splice, have some fun, get some samples for my track ideas. And that's how I found this one right here, which I'm going to break down in a second. But that's why I made this track. Number one, scrolling through Splice, gave up on the house BPM, went to drum and bass, found it, liked it, already heard the track in my head. And number 2, around that time, I discovered 2 new drum and bass songs that were really synth heavy. I always listen to drum and bass, and all these tracks have their own unique characteristics. Some are more groovy, some are liquid, some have the kind of dance floor energy. Some are very synth heavy, and I'm a pretty big synth heavy, person. I like tracks with a lot of synths and supersaws, which is why when I heard this vocal sample, and around that time I was listening to some synth heavy drum and bass tracks, I wanted to make one. So I heard the vocal sample, started to picture the track in my head, wanted to make a synth heavy drum and bass track, and that's why I made this track. All right, so we're going to be starting with intro here. Intro was designed to just kind of ask the listener, and I produced it this way, to ask the listener to just take a listen and really observe the decisions that the producer is making. Because if you listen to the track, it's the same drums, the same synth, just presented in different patterns. Intro asks the listener to just listen to the variation in patterns, right? It's not that complex of a track as far as the sound design and changes go, as far as kind of musical changes, effects and all that stuff. But it has a lot of rhythmic change. And again, the point of that is for you to consider that there's basically 3 ways this track could have gone. You hear the second pattern right here where the synths are more split up and there's a little bit of gaps. And near the end, everything is consistent, right? You have the on-beat kick and snare, 4 on the floor type beat. And the difference there is that it's the same sounds presented in a different way. So all I'm really doing is trying to show that the producer really has the ability to make whatever decisions they want in the track. And even if you have the same sounds, you can take them in many different ways. It's not just about the sounds you use and how filled in the track you can make it, but every decision you make has an impact. Every decision you make is important, which is why in this track, I could have gone one way, I could have gone the other. I'm just demonstrating that you have limitless opportunities. So it's really asking the listener to consider that, well, why did the producer do this? Why is the producer trying to do this? Maybe it's not just about the sounds and how filled and how cool you can make the track sound. Maybe it's about the decisions the producer make. Maybe it's about why the producer did something. Maybe it's about what they're trying to accomplish when they do those things, which is why I like the intro to set up the rest of the track as almost more of a just to keep that thought in your head. Not so much to what am I going to listen to? Is it going to be, groovy? Is it going to be filled? Is it going to have a lot of big drops and things? It's asking you to think about the decisions the producer is making and why they did that, and realizing that, hey, the producer went this way specifically probably for a reason. All right, so of course I need to start by talking about why I made this track. Where do I even begin? All right, so why did I make this track? Now I mentioned that each track was inspired by a piece of a media, whether it be a TV show or a movie, but this is actually the one exception to this. So Empty and Alone was actually inspired by a different track. I made a track probably in 23, maybe in 22, that had a very, very, very similar feeling, but I wasn't really satisfied. I didn't have a clean cut direction. It just lacked some properties that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was mostly that. It was just kind of the direction. It was more of kind of a collection of feelings and sounds than a track with, progression that I really like. But the point is, once I realized that I didn't really like that, but I still wanted a track with that emotion. And it was around the time the Expression EP was kind of, you know what, it would be nice to kind of get an EP or some works that captured this feeling and the sound that I really like. And that's when I made Empty and Alone. That's when I thought, let me just kind of start from scratch and try to revamp that feeling. And that's how this track was born. So the point of Empty and Alone is really just to capture that feeling. I mean, the title says it all, Empty and Alone. Now, I mentioned that this track is inspired by a piece of, in this case, a TV show. And that TV show, again, shares those empty and alone feelings. Empty and Alone is kind of that weird one where it's a little bit more vague, where it's really just taking those feelings in that TV show where the main character is, empty and alone, and just trying to throw them into a DAW and trying to blend with it that winter feeling of, cold air and silence and loneliness and all that stuff that you get, when it's 30 degrees Fahrenheit outside. It gets dark at 4 p.m. And you're just kind of, you're by yourself and you're just kind of thinking, well, what do I do other than just hop into my DAW? This is me at this point. What do I do other than just get to my place and hop into my DAW and try and produce some music? So that's where this Empty and Alone track was born. It kind of takes those winter feelings that were shared by the protagonist of that TV show, and it just places them in here. Now, next we have Betrayal. Betrayal probably tells the best story out of all of the tracks on my EP. Now, Betrayal was inspired by, again, I mentioned this whole EP is inspired by TV shows and movies. Betrayal essentially is inspired by watching a movie or watching a TV show where a TV show or a movie that you really like, that you really want to end one way, and then the whoever it is, the writer, the director, the author, decides to just take a complete 180 and ends it in a way that you really, really don't like. Now, I'm sure all of us can think of a TV show or a movie that end this way. I know one comes to mind to me, but that's the whole point of the track. The whole point of the track is the track goes in one direction and then it betrays you and ends in a direction that you really don't think it should end, where it almost feels like, the author or the writer betrayed you in that sense. It's about taking one track that's going one way and just completely switching it, where it feels like you're betraying your audience. The whole point of the track, the whole point of Betrayal is that when you get this nice, beautiful drop over here and it betrays you into something that you don't like, something we're gonna, in this context, called disgusting, at the end, what it does is it resolves that emotion. Is that after you heard that, after you've been betrayed, it ultimately gives you what you wanted in the first place, which is why you get this buildup right here. You get the bass growl one more time to make you think you're going in one way, but it resolves that emotion and gives you exactly what you want. It gives you precisely what you wanted by giving you the full drop without being betrayed, without, it's giving you essentially what you wanted, what you should have had, what the audience maybe even deserves in the first place. So that's why I really like this track. That's why I think it tells the best story. And that's why I included it in this EP. Now, up next, we have Twilight. The whole point of Twilight is to capture that feeling of twilight where, the sun's just starting to go down. It's starting to get dark, but there's still a little bit of light in the sky. And Twilight is pretty much the perfect song just for driving windows down, listening to this, while it's just starting to get dark. And the whole story that Twilight's trying to tell is, it's about two melodies in this case that are kind of moving around each other. You can hear they're moving in different directions. And it's about two melodies taking kind of two different paths and just moving around each other, but never really meeting. And that whole story is being told throughout this whole second half of the track, where these two melodies are moving, they're kind of doing different things, and you still get the fullness of the super saws, the fullness of the bass, and some really nice melodies to your ear. And what ends up happening is these melodies are kind of moving around each other, and at the end they start to come together a little bit closer and closer until finally they converge at the end. So that's the story being told in Twilight. That's what you can listen to if you're listening to the track. All right, and up next we have Case Chords. Now, the reason that Case Chords is so interesting is two things. Number one, I really like the mood of it. I really like the feeling of it. It's really kind of slow and really emotional, especially with these chords. The whole focus is on the chords. And then you get kind of this super saw over here that introduces, again, still that dark, that winter feeling to it, that cold air feeling to it when it's dark outside. And it goes back to the piano, goes back to the chords, and gives you kind of that spacey chords over here, the super saws that take up a lot of space, and it really captures that feeling nicely. The second reason case chords is important, and this is probably the main focus of this track, not necessarily focus, but the main kind of main feature of this track, I'll say, is that case chords is an interesting exception to my tracks, where in the context of the EP, this makes sense. Case chords starts with a drop right here, where the kick and snare come in, and it's a shorter track because it's pretty sustained in energy. The energy, the movement, the rhythm is pretty constant throughout, but the whole thing is just meant to be a constant stream of music, where the drums don't go away, you get the drop again. And it really does a good sense in that regard, where it's the second to last track, it's the penultimate track, and it's a little bit more almost like an intermission, but not necessarily. It's just that consistent energy that gives you just enough of a break from the progression that you had and all over the place. So it gives you a little bit of a break from that and just keeps things pretty constant, pretty steady before the final track of the EP. Now, finally, we have Journey Beyond. Now, the story being told here and the feeling being portrayed is really just like a journey. Again, this is inspired by a very specific piece of media, and if you just listen to the track, it's almost like it's telling a similar story, where it has its ups, it has its downs. It's a little bit harsh in some places, it's a little bit dark, it's a little bit mysterious in some places, and the whole thing is a very, very nice journey into, it's a 6-minute journey that takes you all over the place. Even though the songwriting intention isn't there as much, the fact that it's a very long track, and I made it a very long track, just gave me a lot of room to make very intentional decisions in the track, in the progression, and all those things. But it definitely does a good job of demonstrating intention in a music production sense. It has nice synths, it has nice bass, it has a nice melody. So that's one of the other reasons I really like this track. It's long, it has a great progression, it's 6 minutes, the progression is great. And finally, it's also a little bit more orchestral and a little bit more cinematic, which I really, really like. I like orchestral elements, I like things like movie scores. So the fact that it includes something similar to that type of feeling is something that I really like about this track. So, per usual, I need to talk about why I made this track and why I called it Understanding, and this is a very interesting one. All right, and of course, finally, most importantly, why did I name it Understanding? This is kind of a big one because it has quite a bit of intention to it. Maybe not as much as something like Empty and Alone, but it's an important track to me, and I named it Understanding for a reason. So I was super big into uplifting trance, and I'm hearing this track, and I'm like, I mean, this is nothing like the trance that I like. Why bother even working on it? So there was a while there where I seriously scrapped this track because I just really wasn't satisfied with this track. I thought it's just too simple, it's too basic, it's just too plain, and it doesn't really kind of sound a lot like the trance I like. And then I started listening to more trance, and I thought, you know what, this does fit in the world of trance somewhere. But not only does it fit in that world, I made it, and I wanted to fit in that world, and I'm making it fit in that world, not kind of by force, but in the sense that, well, maybe I just don't think it fits in that world because, you know, this isn't something I would listen to because this is finally something I made. So it's something I would listen to, but it's not something I have listened to. It's something new. But of course it's something new because, well, I mean, I made it, I'm working on it. I'm not going to make a track that sounds exactly like another track. This is going to be it. So yes, this does fit in the world of trance somewhere. And that's really where the track idea came from. That's why I decided not to scrap it. There were elements of this track that I liked, and they were so simple, but I liked them enough that I didn't want to kind of forget about them and ditch them completely. And it was in that moment that I kind of realized that, you know what, just because I find this track simple, I don't really find it simple, but it kind of sounds simple. That doesn't mean that it doesn't, A, kind of capture some of the characteristics that I like in music production, and B, that doesn't mean I can't like it. This track was really about two things. Understanding was about two things. It was about A, understanding me and myself as a producer, and kind of realizing and half accepting, we'll say, realizing/accepting that, hey, even though this track is a simple track, there are elements I like, and everything I did about it kind of works together intentionally, even though it's simple changes. All these things over here kind of work together and I like, and it's just understanding that that's who I am as a producer. I'm not going to make them, probably not. I'm not going to make the most complex track in the world to have the best sound design, have the best mixing, have everything be super full, super commercial. But I am going to make tracks that I like that have these small switch ups that capture these characteristics that I like that represent me, And that's ultimately, this track is about me understanding me. And finally, this track is also about hopefully having the audience and the crowd also understand who I am as a producer, because like I said, this is a trance track, B, a 4 minute and 4 minute 23 second track, and C, a simple track that has some, again, just very bread and butter standard progression to it, that if you open your ears and you allow yourself to listen for it, you can appreciate it. But if you don't, you will not. Same thing I said actually with Empty and Alone. So the whole idea is that, you know what, if you really want to understand me, just like that, just like intro, open your ears, take a step back, and listen for what I'm doing with this track. Don't listen for the sound design, don't listen for the complexity, but listen to the decisions I make and listen to what's going on in the track. In my eyes, it's not simple. And it's not simple because of what I did in it, which are I did simple things in it that make it not simple. And that's why this track means so much to me. That's why it led me to understand myself. And that's why I want the audience and the listener to understand me as a producer better through this track.